how do we know when our self-love becomes selfish?
Sure. Wow. What do you mean? That's a bit of an interesting question.
Like
Mm-hmm.
these days, it's been like self-love, self-care, self-care routine. Everything is about oneself, and that's
Mm.
really good. But it's becoming like now all we care about is ourselves. And I've noticed something with me
Mm-hmm.
personally. Like it's been that thing of let me do my
Mm-hmm.
self-care
Yeah.
before everything else
Everything.
happens.
Like the notion of do me first,
Yes, and it's
or like Americans say, it's all about the number one.
yeah. So
Okay.
how do you know to balance your own wellness
Mm-hmm.
and your own, like health, I guess,
Mm.
while also still keeping others in mind to maintain healthy and balanced relationships?
Okay. So if you're looking at it from a relationship, because the question you asked is quite, you can unpack it in many different ways. But what I noticed, there was a lot of self, 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 you
Yeah.
know, and the other question was the how question. Now, the thing is, most people, young people especially, think that the Bible's outdated. It's something that is just so archaic. It's all about David that they learned about in Sunday school, David and Goliath. Oh gosh, don't bore me more. I mean, I need something relevant today.
Yeah.
Or they think, oh well, Jesus, he had nothing else to do except to read, what was meant for him. But you know what's also interesting? The same question you're asking, David asked it in Psalm 119, verse 9, where he says, yo, I'm really concerned about being a young person. It's really, really difficult because how can a young person stay pure? And I think that's where you're asking it from, the
Yeah.
purity of heart. And when David asked this, the other thing is we also had Jeremiah who's saying, you know what, you need to be very careful about self because there is nothing more wicked than the human heart. In fact, maybe that's the scripture I'll read as cautioning, but we're obviously not going to answer the whole thing
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Jeremiah 17:9 says, the human heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is? Now, with your question around self this, self guide, put number one first. Where does it come from? It comes from the heart. And when the focus becomes so inwardly focused, we understand then why later on in the New Testament, Paul is talking to another young person, Timothy. He says, Timothy, young man, in the last days, things are going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to be a follower of Jesus because people are going to be what? Lovers of themselves. So we've got three different scenarios. One is David asking the same thing. How do I live a pure life as a young person? So would you say David's question is irrelevant this day and age?
No.
Okay.
definitely not.
It's the same one you're asking now, right?
Yeah.
And then the other guy, Jeremiah, when he says, sure, the human heart, would you have thought that your heart is deceitful?
Yes, I know.
True. And yet God tells us in scripture, and we're going to have these conversations more
Yeah.
around, if I'm relying on my own heart, chances are I'm relying on something so wicked, because that's what the word uses. It is wicked and no one can understand it. And yet again, we get another warning that in the last days, and the description about how will we know in the last days, people will be lovers of themselves. Yeah. So now it sounds really packed around how this self-love can almost border in stepping outside of the way that God can help you with this heart that he created. Because if you're created by God, don't you think that he might have a plan for this self-love
Definitely.
and the wicked heart and all the questions that you might have?
Yeah.
So maybe as we continue, we will find the answers that are still relevant to a young person around how do I stay pure? How do I balance self-love? And you mentioned around bordering on selfishness, right?
Yes.
Sure. And the selfishness you described for me the other time around, what were you doing when you were thinking that you are loving self and it's becoming selfish when you look yourself in the mirror and you look yourself? Just tell me about that a little bit.
So, a while back, I became really like self-centered, and I thought, you know what? let me just focus on myself, because maybe I'll be more widely accepted by my friends and my family, because maybe I'll be more refined if I think more about myself than I do about others. So it had always been this thing of, let's say I'd be at an event and people would take pictures and they'd be really happy with the pictures, but it would always be like, I'd run to the person's phone and I'd be like, wait, how did I look? How did I,
start doing some self-criticism?
Yeah, and it's been like, that became stressful, because it was always like, now we need to keep that image. Now we need to stay looking how I looked the last time.
You know what's the word right there? What started off as something good, you looking at, okay, does a picture look good, but started becoming what? Stressful. So it put a burden on your heart, and it started giving you anxiety that my pictures need to look a particular way. For me to be acceptable by other people, I need to feel that they see me in only this angle and not that angle, and it's the anxiety and the stress that started off as something that you thought was good, which is self-love. Then suddenly this self-love is becoming a stressful thing. And with God's way of loving self, or being appreciated and welcomed as you are, because God says come as you are, and that's exactly what we'll be unpacking as we continue to walk and answer these questions that started way before your time, in David's time, that says, how can a young person lead a pure life, considering we have a wicked heart, and that all matters of life flow out of this heart. So it starts with the heart. And maybe that's where we'll start with the conversation and answering these questions, that how do I manage loving myself, but understanding when am I bordering from self-love that becomes deceit in terms of selfishness, that's the word you use, and vanity, and we know vanity is one of the sins that got Lucifer out of heaven, right? And then the stress and anxiety that builds up in a young person who's trying to be picture perfect according to what the world standard says. But you know what, in closing, not closing forever, but just now, is that God says, I am fearfully, wonderfully made. Great is his work. I am his masterpiece. And each time you think that I'm getting stressed about my looks, how about thinking that's what God thinks when he looks at you? He says, wow, what a masterpiece. And you say to yourself, I am fearfully, wonderfully made. Great is his mighty work. And that's what David eventually said, in one of the Psalms. All right, thank you so much. We'll chat back again.